Yes.
The Burning Tower of the Drish House in Tuscaloosa. And the
Yeah,
reason it is one of my favorites. Go ahead.
Brock had mentioned that. He was like, "Oh, let's get Nixie to definitely talk about the Drish House."
Yeah.
We were gonna try to go by it a couple of weekends ago, but it just didn't work out for our what we had going on, and it got late. So yeah.
Well, the Drish House is a favorite of mine because it is a local story. I like the stories from around Tuscaloosa, especially the Drish House. There's Van de Graaff Mansion, where they have a lot of events that was originally had been originally a library after it was a residence for the city of Tuscaloosa. It's been told so many different times. Drish House has this air of mystery because working in television, I spent 3 years trying to get in this house to do a ghost story on it. And only in the third year was I able to get in because, as you can tell from the culmination over the years, that top picture when it was still a plantation house to when it saw some of its darker days as a salvage yard to when it had been an abandoned Baptist church and had all these other structures built around it. And it was just a pale comparison of its former self. But you could not get in that house. And I was bent on getting in there. And finally, in 2008, I called the same people I had been calling at the time. The house was either owned or at least maintained by the Tuscaloosa. What was their name? Preservation Society, the Tuscaloosa Preservation Society. And they finally said, yes, you called just in time. We'll let you in. As a matter of fact, we have a group coming in to do some paranormal investigating in the house. Maybe you can join forces with them for your story. And I'm like, brilliant. Yes, that would be great. So thank you for that. So, but anyway, some history on the house. It's called the Drish House because a man named Dr. John Drish built it around 1830. And if you're familiar with Tuscaloosa, it's just off Greensboro Avenue, and it's along 17th Street, which is just below one of the main drags, 15th Street. You can actually see it pretty well from 15th Street, and you can see it really well from the side of Interstate 359 and Literally and Wallace Boulevard as you're going into downtown Tuscaloosa. Since they tore down, if you see that bottom right picture with the brick structure, since they've torn that down, you can really make the house out from the interstate now.
Yeah.
Dr. Drish was even though he had a plantation, and back in this time, as you can tell from that top picture, it was probably a pretty wide plantation.
Yeah.
Even though he had this large plantation, he was a very poor manager of it, and he was often drank and he gambled. And it's often been said that he'd take a boatload of cotton to Mobile to sell, and he'd come back weeks later broke with nothing more than a hangover and a remorseful conscience. So says Catherine Tucker Wyndham.
So did he stop at Wind Creek Casino down there?
Yeah, probably so. Yeah. I had also heard he would wind up in New Orleans for like a month bender occasionally at times, and then he would show back up at home, and his wife would always forgive him. These are some of the things that I just couldn't get into the story when I did this for TV years ago that they told me about that was gold. But he died in 1867. He was about 70. He was in his 70s, I think, early 70s. Mrs. Drish, during the funeral, Mrs. Drish had used these funeral candles because, of course, back then you have the funeral at home. You're laid out at home, and there's always the ceremonial ornaments or whatever that you use for funerals, just like you would weddings and stuff like that. And they had these candelabras or candeliers with these very large candles in it. And for whatever reason, she was very obsessed with these candles and made the point to say, I want these candles used at my funeral. Well, 1884 rolls around, and that's when Mrs. Drish passes. And they spend a lot of time trying to find these candles in that house to no avail. So, some years later, not very long later, the house is sold to Judge William Cochran, and his family moves in. This is within about 2 years of Mrs. Drish's passing. And that's when all the strange things began to happen. Those being, in particular, the burning tower. People would walk by this house. This house is fairly close to downtown Tuscaloosa.
Yeah.
And people would be walking by and would see what appeared to be the tower on fire. Now, this is sort of a Spanish-esque architecture. So it has a dome, but the dome looks more like a tower than a dome. And they would see this on fire, and they'd run up to the house, beat on the door, Judge Cochran, your house is on fire. And they would all go in, go up to the tower to make sure it wasn't on fire. And sure enough, there wasn't the first burnt ember, anything. No ash, nothing.
Right.
It has not been on fire at all. This happens more than once. And actually, over the years, Tuscaloosa police had reports of people calling it in, whether it was for a joke or not,
Mm-hmm.
into at
Yeah.
least the 1950s, 1960s, possibly. There would be reports that, hey, we see the house on fire, or the
Right.
church on fire, as it wound up being later on. The other story, a little a little creepier than just the tower, was of I don't know if it was one of Judge Cochran's children or grandchildren, was sleeping in a bedroom one night and was sort of awake when the door opens and someone comes in and covers them up or tucks them in a little tighter than what they were.
Hmm.
And the child the next day goes to the mother and says, hey, I was not exactly asleep when you covered me up last night. And the mother says, that wasn't me. And then it happens again later on, and it's essentially the same thing. You hear the door open very quietly. You hear what sounds like tiptoeing across the room, and someone was covered up in the blanket.
Huh.
And in the story that I did, where they heard various things at some point, voices or something that came through whatever meter it was they were using, was that same bedroom where all this had allegedly happened in. So I'm not sure if that was Mrs. Drish's bedroom or not.
Okay.
That's where some of this came from. And there had been instances of piano playing in that house. And today the house looks like this. It's an event venue.
Yep.
Mhm.
It has been completely remodeled. They were getting started on it when I ran my story in 2008. It was sort of a two-pronged story where we were telling a ghost story, but also saying how the Preservation Society was working to get this home stabilized, which they had mostly gotten through at that point.
Mhm.
And now it's an event venue. I've been there for events since it's opened up like this. I've not heard anybody say anything weird's going on, but I haven't had a real chance to talk to anybody who's there on a regular basis to say,
Yeah.
yeah, there's some weird things going on, or no, nothing's happening.
Right.
It's all just funk. Well, tonight go ahead.
It's a beautiful house. It is. It's just I love to look at it. It's really beautiful.
Yeah, they did a really good job when they fixed it up. It was a lot more ornate. There was a lot more intricate architecture to the house, inside and outside. You could tell from the outside picture prior. This is the same house. This is what it looked like originally.
Right.
When the church took it, between the time the church took it over and the wrecking yard was there, the church was there after the wrecking yard was. So you see, it still has some of its architecture there. It's hard to see.
Yeah.
Well, some of it's still there. When the church got hold of it, it was a Baptist church, and they wanted nothing to do with anything ornate. They wanted it as plain as you can get. And
Gotcha.
that's why the house looks like it does now.
Yeah, more stripped down like it is. Yeah.
Exactly. The brick structure here and this one here, I know there's one here, but that was tore down before this was built. This was separate. These were Sunday school rooms, I think, when the church had it, and this was more like the sanctuary here.
Okay.
When the church was still there, and they used this mainly as classrooms.
Okay.
And both sections had been torn down. They have fixed everything back as similar as they could to the way that it was. Interesting notes, especially where these brick structures are concerned. The night I was there, finishing up my story, I was there 2 different occasions. The last night I'm there is when all of the paranormal researchers were there. And I'm out back because you could not go through the front door at this point. This was all blocked off. They had it nailed down basically, but the back door you could get in and out of, straight back. And this was all off limits. Ironically, the reason I couldn't get in this house for those years is they were having to clean up what was basically hazardous material. And by that, I mean bird poop. It was completely full of bats.
Yeah.
They had made a complete mess. Other critters had gotten in there too. It was pretty bad. And they told me every time, call back next year. We really want the exposure for the house, but we're afraid to let you in.
Exactly.
So,
yeah.
Finally, that last year in 2008, they had gotten it cleaned up enough, and it was perfectly fine. I mean, it was a rundown house on the inside. It was nothing like it is now.
Yeah.
It certainly wasn't anything like this top picture is now.
Well, like you said, especially having like a wrecking, the wrecking company using that, and I'm sure with all I know all that too well. And you have all that wrecked cars and stuff built up around there. That stuff's bound to, And it looks like, the tower there, the picture I'm looking at, it was opened up. So,
Yeah. But as I'm there and I'm wrapping up that night, I'm kind of outside the back door, rolling up extension cords, getting my light lighting equipment put up. We put on a pretty decent production out there that night, microphone cables and all that. And there's a roundabout at the Drish House. It's basically in the center of a roundabout now.
Okay.
Hasn't always been that way, especially when it was a plantation. But there was out back, and this is the Drish House, as nice as it is of a venue now, it's still in kind of a rough area. Not overly rough, but it's a little sketch.
Right.
There was this small pickup that pulled up back there with me and about 10 other people who were outside, and some of the researchers there, one of which was active National Guard Reserve, I think, and another might have even been retired Army or some other branch. I'm not sure which. Not exactly small guys, thankfully, in this case, because this very sketchy pickup pulls up, stops, man hops out, wants to know who owns the house. And this is at about 11 o'clock at night. So this is just weird. Well, being the good journalist I was, even though I had the camera turned around, I was recording. Because I'm like, well, if I'm about to be shanked, I'm going to record what's going on. May not be able to see everything, but they'll hear voices.
Put another ghost in the house.
Yeah.
Exactly. So I'm standing up on the porch and I'm watching fairly closely, trying not to act like I'm watching very closely. I'm recording and I see all this go down, and they come. The lady with the Preservation Society was up there with me. We had been chatting just as this started to unfold, and they walk up and man says he wants to talk to somebody with the Preservation Society. And the other guys are like, you're not going in that house. They're keeping him at the curb. And she walks out there. They're like, we'll walk out there with you. And I'm like, I'm hanging out here. I'll just be recording if I need to.
I'm just going to document this whole thing going on.
But I can hear everything from where I'm at. And she walks out there. I hear murmuring, blah, 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 blah. And this box, like an orange crate box, he hands her. She takes it. She walks back over to the porch. They got him like the police is about to arrest him, throw him in the car. And she walks over to the porch and she's looking through it and she gasps and is like, oh my God. And I'm like, what'd you find? She said, I found some original drawings, not necessarily blueprints, but sketches of the house that the builders used.
Oh, wow. Nice.
The gist of this story was this guy had broken into the brick structure, the portion on the right, on this bottom right picture. He'd broken into that at some point and stole a bunch of stuff. We don't know how much. But he said ever since then, he had nothing but bad luck. And he wanted to give that stuff back.
Wow.
Yeah,
no
joke.
This is
bad
what
juju. Bad juju on that guy.
We sit there after he finally leaves and we're going through this and we're all just recanting what just happened and we're all laughing because we're like, what are the odds?
Yeah.
Really?
So this guy like brings back some fairly important stuff that nobody even knew existed.
Oh, that is wild.
To the history of that house. Which the fact that he thought he had been spooked all these years because he had broken into it.
Yeah.
And chances are he had broken into the rest of the house and just didn't tell us that.
Yeah.
But the fact that he brought it back, he gave us another good haunted story that I've got on tape somewhere probably.
Yeah.
That this happened to him. And he was hoping that by giving that back and putting it back with the house that he would get, all his bad luck to go away.
How about that?
So, yeah.
This house is clear.
Yeah.
Which is wild is it's called the Burning Tower, but like one of the largest fire departments is now they built, a few years ago right down from it.
Yeah, exactly. So probably for good reason.
Yeah.
They may still get phone calls. They just don't tell the public.
Yeah. They look out the back. They look out the back door and like, it's good.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people at Tuscaloosa 911 who are like, we don't know whether to believe these people or not. Let's just put a firehouse over there.
Yeah.
Because now you can just take a webcam up there 24/7 and just make sure.
But interestingly, and this gets personal, as I'm doing some research this evening, trying to make sure I have all my ducks in a row, and I'm telling most of these stories fairly accurately, or as accurately as I can. I'm going through a book that is not 13 Alabama Ghosts and Jeffrey, but it's called The Haunting of Alabama by Dr. Alan Brown, who I mentioned earlier, who was one of my friends going on some of these excursions with ghosts. We did one that's coming up, I'll show in just a minute. We did the Lynn Henley Library together, and we did Sloss Furnaces. The other is a pretty good one because most people don't know anything about that one. But he wrote, after I had done this story in 2008, this story aired on the TV station I was working for on October 30th, 2008. This book was written sometime after that, a couple of years after. 2017. Okay, so a good little while after that, almost 9 years after that. Anyhow, he goes into a section at the end of the story on the Drish House about a paranormal research group investigating at that house on October 6th and October 16th. Well, I spent time twice with the Tuscaloosa Paranormal Research Group, evidently on October 6th and October 16th, because I went with them. I know the last time, it's the 16th, had to be, because I knew it was a few days before the story run. And I had gotten that there to tail end probably that about 2 weeks before on the 6th. But he mentions in this passage, they collected a number of intriguing electronic voice phenomena, EVPs, on the first and second floor, including that way, thank you, my thing's in there, help me, and the one that freaked me out a little bit, hey Mike.
Ooh.
Stop it.
There was no Michael there. There was no Mike there. I don't believe. There might have been. And if there was 2 of us. So they were messing with me or the other Mike too, if there was another there. And I was like, okay, I'm gonna close this book now.
Oh,
I've had this book since 2017 and did not know that until this
I love
evening.
that.
Was
That's
like,
awesome.
oh, good Lord. So